Hello and very welcome to Lesson 3. Lesson 3 is on social influence. So that is the unit on social influence. And we today are going to be looking at what is obedience. What is obedience? And to give you page numbers, that's page 108, 109 in your textbook. And what I'd like you to do whilst we're giving you this narrative is obviously, as per usual, you know I'm going to say, write key notes, please. There's also a bunch of key terms on this page. I'd like you to make sure you know those in relation to agency, agency theory, obedience, social factors, agentic state, etc. What are those things? Making sure that you're cool with those particular terms. Let's get going. So, what does obedience mean? Obedience is when people follow orders of an authority figure. Much of the time, this is perfectly acceptable. For example, when we follow an instruction from a lifeguard or a doctor, and it probably keeps us safe and perhaps even in some instances alive. However, what happens if you are ordered to do something that you think is wrong? Okay, have you ever been in that situation, possibly at school, where perhaps a teacher or a member of staff is telling you to do something, and actually you are aware of information that is not? Interesting one. Some of the worst things in history would not have occurred perhaps if people had gone against sources of authority. For example, during the Second World War, Nazi soldiers, had they turned around and said, no, I'm not doing that, then it would perhaps not have led to death of millions of Jews, homosexuals, travellers, etc. in concentration camps. Psychologists have tried to understand, in actual fact, why. Why did the Nazis do what they did when perhaps they knew it to be wrong? You know, were they just generally not a nice group of people? Did they not have any sense of consciousness? Well, there was a particular psychologist actually called Stanley Milgram. Now, in 1963, he did a very famous study called Milgram's agency theory. Now, in this study, he got participants and he asked them. It was actually done rather covidly, actually, in that the participants did not actually know what they were really getting themselves into. You could argue there that there were perhaps whether this was ethical, that they weren't given all the information in the first instance. However, had they known, obviously Milgram couldn't do his experiment. But there were some participants and there were some Confederates. In other words, remember, a Confederate is somebody who knows exactly what is going on. The Confederates were always the students, were always the learners. The participants were always the teachers. You see, when the students got a particular question wrong, the Confederate, in other words, the learner, I apologise, the participant, i.e. the teacher, would press a button. That button would administer an electric shock. Now, that's all well and good, perhaps not particularly well and good, but that would be okay if you were administering the same level of electric shock all the time and it wasn't particularly high. But the more questions that the students got wrong, our Confederates, the higher the voltage went, until you got to 450. Fatal. Fatal at least to those people with any kind of perhaps heart condition. Now, shockingly, 64% of participants got to the potentially fatal 450 and actually delivered it. Typically, what often needed prompting from a so-called scientist who was nothing more than an actor, dressed up to the nines in his uniform. This is important because it I suppose helps with social compliance or conformity or obedience, I should say. If one looks the part, that you would, I digress, but you would assume that somebody was an expert, certain age, certain look, etc. But 64% actually did administer the fatal dosage. And these people were not bad people. They were people like you and I, members of society who were perhaps fun and pleasant to be around, but showed a perhaps, if you will, a dark side, or perhaps showed something that perhaps there are more people, maybe we hate to admit this, but we could very much be like those Nazi soldiers, and that, yes sir, we follow orders. Now, it's worth saying that many of the participants would turn around and say, listen, I'm not doing this, I'm not comfortable with this. But all the time, the doctor, or the scientist I should say, would take full responsibility and say, listen, you know, it's a name of science, I take responsibility for this. And it's almost like, and I think the Nazis must have felt similarly, and I think this is the point that that Milgram proceeds to make, in that people almost kind of, they that, if you will, the heavy load of responsibility that once rested upon their shoulders has been alleviated and put onto that scientist. It's their fault, I'm just following orders. And this seemed to be very much the case with when Nazis were finally pursued and caught, that very few of them actually apologized, because they honestly felt they were just following orders, it wasn't their fault. So you can see that there are huge comparisons with Stanley Milgram's experiments, and of course the Nazis during the 1940s. Now, a few words really to mention. A feeling of agency is a responsibility we feel for our own actions. For example, when we enter, we at the moment are in an autonomous state. In other words, we feel we're quite independent. But when we enter an agentic state, we are very much following what has been asked of us. And Milgram noticed that there was a shift in many of the participants who once had an autonomous, who were independently thinking, and the doctor, or again I should say the scientist, perhaps created a shift, so they entered an agentic state. And really famous study. Good luck, guys. If you're asked a question on obedience, Milgram is not a key study, but an absolutely fantastic one to bring in, and I would recommend YouTubing Milgram's electric shock experiment, and you'll get some good views. Okay, take care. Good luck.